Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. Her name is Lyn Smith Gregory, and you can see her on her website right here if you're watching this on YouTube, X, or Rockfin. And she has an interesting story to say, but she is actually a direct descendant of the founder of what we call the Latter-day Saints Church or Mormonism. And his name was Joseph Smith. So you see in her name, she has the Smith, Lyn Smith Gregory. And I've done a couple shows. I've done a few shows with other women, interestingly enough, who have left the Mormon church. One was titled Loose Cannons, a memoir of mania and mayhem in a Mormon family. And her name was Diana Cannon Ragsdale. And then I also did a show on occult Joseph Smith with Heidi of the Unfiltered Rise podcast. So I know a little bit about Mormonism. We're talking in the pre-show just about me growing up with a lot of different religions and ethnicities, but she has an interesting story to tell. We're kind of going to focus, we're trying to figure out like what angle we were going to take in the pre-show. I think it's kind of like family estrangement. I think that's a common theme for people who leave Mormonism, but it also is a common theme for people. I've talked to people who have left the Seventh-day Adventists and the Yahweh one, I forgot the name of it. But like some of these, they also experience
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Thank you, Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll just skip my mind. But people like that. So it's actually been an interesting theme in some of my investigative podcast work. But Lyn can talk more about that. So Lyn Smith Gregory, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, William, for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I find your podcast absolutely riveting. And I'm glad to be here and talk a little bit about my story.
Great.
I grew up in a big family, typical Mormon family. I have 8 brothers and sisters, and we were sort of an anomaly in Utah because we were related to Joseph Smith. Most of Joseph Smith's descendants stayed back in Nauvoo, Illinois. And my great-great-grandfather was orphaned when Joseph Smith was killed. And he came west with Brigham Young and settled in Utah. And so that makes us a little bit rare in Utah to have a direct connection to Joseph Smith.
And that's kind of, sorry to interrupt, but that's kind of important in Mormonism, your kind of lineage or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of my childhood as Mormonism on steroids, because there was the aspect of being perfect, which is part of the Mormon culture, but it was even more so in our case. It felt a little bit like living in a glass house where my father repeatedly said, "Don't forget, you are an example. People are looking to you to represent what the ideal Latter-day Saint, how the ideal Latter-day Saint behaves." And so there was tremendous pressure about looking and doing the right thing. And I was a true believer. I believed exactly. I think personally that we're all hostage to the first belief systems about our worldview that we get as children. And unless you have a specific reason to investigate that and take it apart, unpack it, that remains your reality of what the world is all about. So growing up, I left the Mormon church unexpectedly. I had gone to a non-Mormon university instead of Brigham Young University, but it was supposed to be temporary. I graduated a year early from high school and had missed the deadline for applying to Brigham Young. So I went to a state school just for a year. And at that school, I encountered a professor who I adored that I found out was an atheist. And he found out I was not only a Mormon, but a descendant, and he challenged me to take his Bible as literature class the next semester, and basically let me know I would be expected to defend my faith in that class. And I was excited about the challenge. I thought, oh, I'm going to prove to this professor that just how true my religion really is. And so I didn't go home. And for the week between the semester break, I went to the library and requested books and news articles, etc., that were forbidden for me to read as a Mormon. They weren't in my library because it was in Utah, and I had to request them. And when I got them, I spent the next week researching everything I could about Joseph Smith and the early history of the Mormon faith. And I started with Fawn Brody's book, No Man Knows My History. And it's still one of the definitive books on Joseph Smith. And suddenly I was experiencing with this sinking feeling in my stomach that this was not the narrative that I had grown up learning about my revered ancestor. But
Maybe you can share what the kind of growing up in that, what you were told to believe or what you were taught to believe. Maybe some people don't know the totality. Like Joseph Smith was almost as important as Jesus in the hierarchy, right? Like he was the
yes, exactly. I mean, next to Jesus, Joseph Smith was considered not just a modern day prophet, but was revered as unquestionably next to Jesus Christ as a saint. And so that is what made me special. I remember the envy my friends had when they found out, oh, you're related to Joseph Smith. Wow. And I felt special, set apart, chosen even. And all of a sudden I'm reading about this man and who I had revered, and I'm finding out that very reputable sources, historians, scholars, uh, newspaper articles of the times, uh, told me a very different story about the early beginnings of the church and about my famous relative. And I I was a good Mormon. I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, no sex, no coffee, no Coca-Cola, no swearing. And it was, the intention, particularly as a young woman, was focused on purity and being righteous enough to fulfill your greatest promise was to marry a righteous man and become a wife and mother and bring more souls to usher in the second coming of Christ, Zion. So I get to this place in my life. I'm in the library, I'm reading these pages, and they make sense to me. And I'm like, oh no, I just didn't know what to do with the information. But suddenly I was seeing Joseph Smith growing up in a family who believed in visions, who believed in folklore, magic, who had been digging for gold, told his neighbors he had a special peepstone that he could put in a hat and it would tell him where buried treasure was. And he basically was finally arrested on fraudulent charges for charging his neighbors money to find gold that he never delivered on. And I suddenly could see the connection between what happened, his upbringing, and also his story that God and Jesus had appeared to him and told him that none of the churches were right, and that he was set aside selected to restore the true one and only gospel to the earth, that none of the religions that existed, they had fallen into iniquity. And the Book of Mormon is supposedly the history of the civilizations before the Native Americans, our current Native American population, but they were supposedly two tribes from the lost tribes of Israel that sailed to the North America continent and created these grand civilizations. And the Book of Mormon is supposedly the history of what happened. And these two tribes had a war, and the losing tribe was wiped from the face of the earth, and the wicked tribe that succeeded was cursed with a dark skin. Joseph Smith's explanation for why Native Americans had darker skin. And so this was something I bought hook, line, and sinker. And these gold plates, what he said that he conveniently found in a hilltop several miles from his farm, no one ever saw. But he maintained that he was able to translate them with this special use of a peepstone, once again bringing back his earlier background as a gold digger.
Which the peepstone is still in the Mormon Museum in Salt Lake City. Like, you can see the peepstones that Joseph Smith had. There's no question about it.
Right. And in fact, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is what most of Joseph Smith's descendants started after Joseph Smith was killed, have on display in their museum all kinds of folklore that the Smith family believed in: magic, water, witching, cloaks,
Dowsing.
umbrellas.
There's like a magic like blanket with all kinds of sigils from like that era, from the 18th century. Like, it's really something else.
Yeah, it really is. But I had never understood the Mormon Church in context of the religious ferment that was happening at the time, and how Joseph Smith was able to take his experiences in the world and use the ferment of a lot of upstart religions happening to come up and create a religion out of whole cloth.
It was called, sorry to interrupt, but the northern part of New York at that time was called the Burnt Over District, because it wasn't just the Mormons. There was all kinds of other sectarian stuff and fights and really passionate, intense.
Yeah,
it was right,
there was religious fever at the time, and he was caught up in that. I also found out that there was a book that talked about the Native Americans as possibly belonging to the lost tribes of Israel as an explanation. And it's very obvious to anybody who compares this book, the Book of Abraham that this man wrote, and the Book of Mormon, that Joseph Smith got the vast majority of the ideas for the Book of Mormon from this already pre-existing book. I was devastated. I did not know what to do with myself. You know, it is so deeply indoctrinated that it felt like the ground beneath me just disintegrated. And I didn't know what to do, but I really couldn't unsee what I had now seen. And the very, very disturbing, when I grew up in the Mormon church, no one admitted that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. They said polygamy started with Brigham Young. But Joseph Smith was a very active polygamist, marrying not only 41 women in the course of a decade, but girls as young as 14 who sometimes were in his home under his care and protection, but also married, would send his friends on missions to convert people into Mormonism and marry their wives in their absence. And I was distraught. And then when he was actually martyred because a Nauvoo printing press printed allegations with facts accusing Joseph Smith and other leaders in the church of polygamy. And he ordered that the printing press be burned down. And that's why he was arrested. And he was actually held in jail for protection because there was an angry mob who was out to get him. And eventually they succeeded. They stormed the jail and shot him. He and his brother were both
Right.
killed.
And you're related to another brother. So Joseph Smith was part of a big family. I think he had
Yeah,
2 or 3 or 4 brothers.
exactly. And Samuel Smith, my great-great-grandfather, was Joseph Smith's younger brother and the first convert and first missionary to the Mormon church. He was a true believer as well. And mysteriously, and this was something I didn't know either, was that there was some question about who was going to become the next prophet. And Joseph Smith had designated Samuel, my great-great-grandfather, as his heir apparent if something should happen to him. Well, when he tried to rescue Joseph and Hiram from the jail, supposedly he got a side ache and a stomach ache, and several weeks later, after being in the care of a doctor, Hosea Stout died mysteriously. It was a stomach ache, and suddenly he was dead. And he was being treated by one of Brigham Young's staunch supporters. And the family believes that Brigham Young ordered Samuel Smith poison, that the medication that he was taking for his stomach ailment was actually poison. And in fact, his last words were, "I've been poisoned." And his wife and Joseph Smith's other brother tried for a very long time to get Brigham Young held accountable for this. But of course, it never happened.
There's
But
a
then,
lot at stake. There's a lot at stake in that succession. So I think there
and
was
one
somebody
of
else
the,
up. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, there was a lot at stake, one of which was the whole concept of polygamy, because Samuel Smith was not a practicer of polygamy and didn't want it to continue. And Brigham Young, of course, was well into polygamy by this point, and so were the other top leaders of the Mormon church. So they did not want Samuel to become the next prophet and leader of the church.
Right. It was Samuel, and then Hiram died with him.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and Hiram is it's a Masonic name, right? Hiram Abiff or
Right.
whatever. So these are the kind of the things that kind of, and there was a known kind of Masonic, I think, lodge at Nauvoo, and all these places are like sacred within the LDS Church, the Hill of Cumorah, Carthage. These are
Yes.
all like revered things of this great church.
Palmyra, New York.
Elmira,
Exactly.
right, right.
But interestingly enough, um, one of the things that Mormons are very secretive about is their rituals and covenants, the secret ceremonies that take place in the temples. And you can't get into the temple unless you're a Mormon in good standing, i.e., you've paid 10% of your income as tithing. So you have to be a someone who's been verified by your bishop as worthy of entering. And it's an actual has your picture on it, ID card that's required to get into the temple. And I grew up believing that Joseph Smith had God had revealed to Joseph Smith the original King Solomon ceremonies. And that's what he was doing with the ceremonies in the Mormon church. But he had also just recently become a Mason. And that was the nail in the coffin for me when I looked at the Masonic rituals and I looked at the Mormon temple rituals and realized they were practically identical, that it was very obvious he had copied these rituals from his Masonic awareness. And I couldn't unsee what I had seen and what I was understanding. And that left me in a very precarious place.
Even the beehive on the Utah flag is Masonic. It comes from Albert Pike and some of these other Masons. And it means it looks so plain on the outside, but inside it's supposed to be busy. So nobody from the outside sees what's going on inside. That's like one of the symbols of Masonry. It's
Uh-huh.
really something else.
Yeah. Well, a lot of Mormonism is secretive. And, so for me, in terms of what happened next, I stopped going to church. I was trying to absorb this information and I wasn't a believer. And in fact, I had decided that if Joseph Smith and Mormonism was a big fake and a fraud, maybe the whole idea of God was a myth as well. And so I thought of myself as an atheist, and I thought, I'm not going to fall for anything. I didn't want to be that vulnerable, that gullible ever again. I felt betrayed. I felt angry, and I felt hurt. And
How old were you? Was this still in college around this time when this happened?
I was 19. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when I stopped going to church, the church came looking for me. And my visiting teachers, which is what they're called when they come and check up on you, came to visit. And they said, we haven't seen you at church or attending seminar, which is, or institute, as they call it in college, which is ongoing church education or indoctrination. And I said, well, I'm not a believer anymore. And they were shocked and appalled and alternately warned me of being cast into utter darkness forever, a daughter of perdition, because I had known the truth and rejected it.
An
And
apostate too. It's almost like
apostate, yes.
Muslims. Like if you're an apostate, it's like the worst. Like, whoa.
Yeah, a heretic, and pleaded with me to get back on a righteous path, that Satan had led me astray. And I was going to do neither of those two things. So I didn't know how to tell my family, but now my hand was forced because I knew they were going to report back to my parents what they had learned. And so I reluctantly called my parents. This was before FaceTime or any other quicker means of communication. And I said, I'm very sorry to tell you, but this is what I believe. And my mother was absolutely devastated, and through her tears, begged me to reconsider. And she said I was shattering the family forever, that I would not be in heaven with the rest of them. And my father was deeply surprised and disappointed, I think, because he and I were close, and he had always held me up to my younger brothers and sisters as an example of how God rewards and blesses you if you are obedient and do as he instructs. And suddenly I was the last person in the family they thought would leave. Um,
Yeah, that's
so
another trait too. That's another especially for women too, is to be obedient, right? Like do what you're told, show up. And you spend a lot of time at church. It's not like 1 hour on Sunday and done. It's like
no,
you're there
it's
3 hours
not
on Sunday, you're there on
3 hours on
Thursday.
Sunday. There's an event happening at church every single night of the week. Monday night is family home evening. Tuesday night is the young people. Wednesday night is for the little ones. It's education. And this is intentional to keep Mormons isolated and in sort of a protective bubble so that they can't they associate with each other, and it reinforces the
The us
message.
against them, right? The us against them, though. They do the same thing in the Jehovah's Witnesses. They keep you at church always or constantly working. And cults, it overlaps with a lot of cult behavior too, actually.
It's interesting. My next blog is about 10 how to tell whether or not a high control, high demand organization is a cult. And there's no question when I look at the Mormon church, it meets most of those characteristics, lack of financial transparency, and, you can't leave without being discredited, a sense of persecution, um, isolated from non Mormons. There's a lot of similarities between cults, and I think it was a cult at the time of Joseph Smith, but still, the prophet is considered um, absolutely beyond reproach. If he says it, that's the way it is. You are discouraged from thinking for yourself, or asking questions, or
Right.
having doubt.
Super. It's like you want to talk about on steroids. It's like authoritarianism on steroids. He's not just the prophet, he's the seer and revelator, if I remember. So it's
Right.
that is not a Christian tradition typically, is this whole seer kind of idea. And he used to have very convenient revelations, if I remember correctly. Like
Yeah,
there'd be a trouble. All of a sudden,
particularly.
I had a revelation last night, guys. We got this
Yeah.
fixed, right?
Yeah, exactly. Very convenient. And unfortunately, he used his revelation of polygamy to tell women they needed to marry him or they would be, um, in jeopardy of their eternal souls. They would not reach the same exalted level in heaven unless they submitted. So it was coercion in the worst kind of form.
It's a very harsh. Like I grew up Catholicism. It's like that too. Like it's really dark. Like you're gonna go to hell. It's actually like that in Muslims. Like you get the hellfire, right? Like who
Right.
wants that? Yeah, and it's a consistent theme in like some of these very harsh, controlling, coercive control environments. Is like the punishment is way worse. Don't do that. But they're really just dictating what people do from the very
Right.
top. Yeah.
And this led to uh, basically a fairly extensive period of estrangement with my family. There was just no place in my family anymore. Mormon culture is very tied up in the church, and community are so interwoven. Marriages, funerals, birthday parties, baptisms, everything that revolves around these family rituals were Mormon. And I suddenly had no place. And not only that, I had lost the respect of my brothers and sisters, who now saw me as somebody who had been led astray, or um, was not willing to make the sacrifices necessary to live up to Mormon standards and ideals. And I think that hurt. No one was curious, like, gosh, what did you discover that made you decide you had to leave this religion? Nobody asked me that question because it didn't matter. I was wrong. I was already unquestionably in the wrong. So there was nothing I could say that would justify my departure. So I moved to New York City sight unseen, and I really basically thought that I could shed my skin like a snake and leave the Mormon sheath behind, and I would emerge shiny and new with this new identity. And unfortunately, that's not the way it worked for me. I found myself not feeling rooted anywhere. And it was before the internet, so I couldn't find other people like myself who had left the Mormon faith. I had heard about them, but I didn't have any way of reaching out or connecting with them. I felt very much alone. I struggled in New York, and atheism left me with a sense of, what is the meaning? What's the whole point? What are we doing on the planet? Are there any rules? Is there such a thing as good and evil? And why does it matter if we're just, this speck of dust, spinning through space? And I found myself really quite lost. And it led me to a place where I had a spiritual awakening or an epiphany, and realized, there's something out there that's bigger than me. I don't know what it is. It's a mystery, but I believe there's something bigger than myself that exists, that is good, that is benign. As Einstein once said, the most important decision any of us ever make is whether we think the universe is friendly or hostile. And I decided I thought the universe was friendly. And so I started a spiritual search for answers at that point. But the estrangement with my family was really challenging. And I would come home once a year for a very at Christmas time, but I was really kind of held at arm's length, and the family still referred to themselves as all Mormons, except Lyn. And sometimes my mother would just ignore the fact that I wasn't a Mormon and say, "Oh yeah, we're all Mormons." Denial worked really well for her. And she thought I would eventually return to the fold, which of course I have not. And, but for
And
better
that
or for
happens sometimes. Like some people leave, come back. Some people leave without saying they're leaving, right? They kind of like become what they
drift
call
away. Mhm.
drift away, Jack Mormons or something like that. Or
Jack Mormons.
yeah,
I think Jack Mormons are people who haven't really resolved the question of whether or not they think it's true or not. They just don't want to be confined with the limitations or belief systems that the Mormon Church, of the Mormon Church narrative. But, so one of the things I hope that readers will find in reading my story is that eventually, because of a explosive secret that got revealed in a family meeting, that rocked the family to the core. And that led the family to say, "Oh, wow, what are we all about here?" Because a couple of my brothers and sisters, and this is decades after I left the church, had also left the church. And we were on the outside, and the family was very, very divided. Mormon or heretic, apostate. And we decided, is there a way for us to have a dialogue? Is there any way for us to bridge the gap? It seemed so huge. And I realize I'm an anomaly in that my brothers and sisters and my parents were willing to engage in family therapy. And we got a non-Mormon, so an objective third-party person trained in family systems to work with us. And we decided to get together once a year and come from wherever we lived in the country and spend 3 or 4 days together. And one day would be in family therapy. And that was extremely helpful. I had already gone to therapy trying to unpack and separate what were my dysfunctional family traumas from my religious traumas. And they were very interwoven. And that had family therapy just allowed us to learn how to communicate with each other in a more respectful way. We realized that there was absolutely no way to discuss religion or politics either, for that matter. So that got taken off the table, and nobody was going to try to convince anybody else that their path was the one true path. So that allowed us to try to be more respectful of everybody's journey and experience, whether we felt that way or not. I'm sure the Mormons, didn't change in their hearts thinking they had the one true faith, but they learned not to discuss us non-believers the same way. And we learned to be much more respectful about talking to them about their beliefs. We also realized that beliefs are not the same thing, or can be actually the same thing as values. And when we stopped looking at them as beliefs and as values, we had similar values and we could find common ground. What did we both agree on? And that helped a lot. And ultimately, we found that we were more alike than we were different. And that helped us create a fragile, tenuous connection once again as a family, and allow us to be with each other without, blowing up the room every few minutes.
Every few minutes, right? So it's less volatile. And why did your brothers and sisters leave? Did they leave? I mean, you said you became an atheist and then kind of came back or morphed into something else. What was their? Did they have similar rationales as you did for leaving, and how did they
Um,
end up?
they actually did some experimenting with drugs and alcohol, and I think in an attempt to just get some release from the intense perfectionistic requirements of my parents, particularly my father. He had unrealistic expectations for all of us. And some of them, my brothers and sisters just said, yeah, I'm never going to please him. So just to hell with it. I'll just, do my own thing. And it was actually in their recovery programs where they actually both came into 12-step programs, and they didn't want to return to the restrictions of the Mormon church either. That was no longer something they believed in.
Right, and that's actually more common. Maybe there's more drug use, maybe out inside Mormonism and kind of its peripheries than people might think. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I also think that in Utah, people who are non-Mormon almost feel like they have to become a warrior. I'm not a Mormon and I'm going to do everything Mormons don't do. And so it's a very intense anti-Mormon group, uh, wild and crazy, actually. I I never came home. I lived in New York City for the next 15 years and would go home once a year, but that was it until we started having family reunions and discussing, um, our experiences and kind of working through those in therapy. But yeah, I think that what has surprised me is what a good job the Mormons have done in presenting themselves as this very wholesome, happy, healthy, family focused religion. And it's really hiding a lot of trauma and a lot of pain and suffering. And they spent a lot of money cultivating that image. And there have been cracks lately in their facade, and it's showing up. I don't know if you saw the whistleblower story that happened in the Washington Post, but several years ago, a whistleblower came forth from and announced that the Mormon Church had, in fact, $100 billion private equity fund that they were misusing.
Oh, wow.
They said it was set aside for charity. This is all the money they get in tithing. So all these Mormons are paying tithing, thinking it's going to charitable works. And in fact, it was propping up Mormon-owned businesses and helped fund the City Creek Mall that is in downtown Salt Lake City now, the Mormon Church owns.
It's an immense amount of money. It's a very, very wealthy church per capita. It's up there in the top, like individual wealth and the church's wealth. And it's not as overt.
It's actually the second, next to the Catholic Church, the second wealthiest Christian religion in the world, with 18 million members worldwide. And I think people think of it as this small, benign group in Utah that has these funny splinter groups that are polygamous who wear funny dresses and, but it's actually a very powerful financial organization. And I think that it has so much power in Utah to control its narrative and its narrative in the rest of the world. But millennials are finding, and Gen Z, etc., they're not happy about the fact that the Mormon Church hasn't evolved. I mean, women, it's a very patriarchal organization. Women are not in any leadership positions. Their only job or role is that of wife and mother, and having as many children as possible to usher in Zion. And that leads to a lot of problems. Utah has one of the highest antidepressant rates in the country. And I think that's because Mormon women have this mother of Zion image that they're supposed to live up to. And let's say Mrs. Jones has 3 children and she's struggling and she doesn't know how she's ever going to have another one and manage to do it all and work as well as be the primary caregiver and homemaker. And across the street, there's Mrs. Allred, and she's got 5 kids, and she seems to do it without a care or a problem, and she looks good on the outside. So it's internalized.
Kind of like a Stepford wife kind of.
Exactly.
And they're always expected to present a good public image. The wife always puts her makeup on 8. Looks good, well-dressed, well-coiffed. Yeah.
Absolutely. Women are very feminine, and they wear makeup, and they are dressed to the nines, and they make their kids clothes, and they're all matching. And, it's a facade, and that is very difficult to maintain. And when Mrs. Allred seems to be able to do it, Mrs. Jones is going, well, what's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me. And so that internalized sense of shame, turns into depression. And so it doesn't surprise me that they have very high rates of depression with Utah women.
Right. So there's all those challenges, those things like that. We're at the 45-minute mark. Do you have time for a few questions?
Sure.
And John B. asks, in your experience, significant percentage of those in civilian U.S. military naval intelligence are Mormon or Mormon family history. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, the CIA and the FBI actually have specific recruitment programs for recruiting Mormons. I don't know if I think there's a combination of a couple of things. Mormons don't drink, don't smoke, don't have affairs. So it minimizes their risk of blackmail. Mormons often go on missions, and so they have learned a foreign language, which makes them more valuable. They have a high work ethic, and are considered to be very honest, dependable people, and obedient. They're used to being told what to do and to following orders.
Right. Right. Clean cut, obedient, follow orders. I mean, it's like the perfect mix for intelligence. Joker asks, like, if in the situation of like this estrangement, what if common ground can't be found? Like you've kind of worked out some type of way to fix things. What if it's not plausible?
I think it's really important to ascertain whether or not there is the possibility, if there is an invitation, is there a desire on both sides of the fence or the divide for something? If there isn't, I don't think estrangement can be healed. There has to be someone who either wants access to their grandkids and are willing to be in a dialogue of how can we make that happen. And but sometimes if common ground can't be found, unfortunately, there's not a lot of hope. um, I don't believe it's acceptable to have toxic relationships where I'm belittled or not treated with respect. So I would distance myself in that situation. Um, but my hope is that we're human beings and we all have the same basic desires to be seen, to be understood, to feel worthy of being loved, for a sense of belonging. And I'm hopeful that somewhere in there we can find our common humanity.
Right. It is. I mean, that's the one thing, like just going through dialogue with your family is like, okay, our values are actually kind of the same, even though we're using different words and different
Yeah,
beliefs and things like that. Yeah.
yeah, the
I think that's
semantics
good.
issue.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Have you ever heard of a movie called Duchess and the Dirtwater Fox?
Yes.
Do you? Margaret asks, how accurate was the Duchess and Dirtwater Fox? I don't know. I've never seen
What
it.
aspect of that?
Well, you have to follow up, Margaret. If you hear this, do an aspect. I don't know, but
I don't know what she's actually referring to, but and it's been a long time since I've seen the movie, but I think that one of the most compelling uh, ways of understanding the dark side of Mormonism would be the recent series based on William Krakauer's, book, Under the Banner of Heaven. And that was really well done. And it explained, I think, the dark side of some of the Mormon revelations and prophecies that Mormons would like to distance themselves from. And it's one of the reasons they can't get away from this connection, um, and of being associated with polygamous groups. They try to, but they can't, because these splinter groups, these polygamists, are quoting Joseph Smith back to them. I mean, polygamy was conveniently banished only when it didn't serve the Mormons anymore, and they couldn't become a state.
right.
Uh, they couldn't gain statehood. without
that was another convenient revelation, right?
convenient
And that
revelation.
yeah,
Yes,
one of the things about the Mormon church, I don't know if it's as common as the other churches. There's a lot of splitting and schisms and things, but the Mormon church has so many splinter groups and subgroups and competitors for the prophets and the new prophets, and a lot of times they go crazy. They get really uniquely,
really out there.
yeah,
Right.
really out there. There was like books, some famous book, like one of the Mormon guys left and found an island in Michigan with his own group, and
Yeah,
there's
there
things that guys
were.
go to Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah, the LeBarons, the Strangs, etc. And and yes, there is still a rift between the LeBarons and the Romneys. Yes, and I don't believe that the mail order brides in the. I've never heard that story being something that the Mormons did.
But the bride, that's another aspect of Mormons that's very unique, is because you're not getting married and going to heaven. You're getting married and spending eternity together. So the
Right.
courtship process is like something else. Like if you really invest that much, like this is my person I'm spending eternity with. Holy smokes. I better like, you know, uh it's
Well,
in it. Yeah.
yeah, unfortunately, it's pretty rapid fire because since there's no sex before marriage, these Mormon courtships often happen. They're very young. These kids get married, and often, 8 months, a year, maybe 2 years at the most, because there's a lot of encouragement to get married right away so that they don't lapse into inappropriate sexual behavior.
Yeah, it's interesting. And kind of the young marriage used to be kind of a Mormon
It
trait.
still is.
It still is, okay.
Yeah. My kids got to know their Mormon cousins at these family reunions, and they didn't really appreciate just how different they were until, my daughter is going off to college, and her cousin the same age is getting married and is pregnant. And all of a sudden it's like, whoa. I mean, my daughter
Yeah.
still isn't married, and this cousin of her now has 4 children.
It's incredible. It's really incredible. There really are changing the dynamics, because kind of as women's liberation and women going to college, half the people in college now are women, if not even more,
Right.
55%. And then the Mormons are still like, hey, woman's place is in the home and the kitchen. And
Yeah, sexism is ranked as one of the most sexist places to live, because there is such there's such an old boys network with the Mormon Church. We used to laugh and call it the secret handshake. If you didn't call them brother so and so, that indicated, oh yeah, you're a Mormon too. Okay, fine, we're good here. Um, you were an outsider, and women, of course, don't have any power to act in God's name, like the priesthood uh, supposedly gives men in the Mormon Church the power to act in God's name. And anytime there's any dissension or struggle or rebellion among the women, it's been quickly nipped in the bud. They've been excommunicated, and their attitude about the whole homosexuality, the whole LGBTQ, um, transgender. I mean, it breaks my heart that uh, they can't find a way to have a convenient revelation that can change things so that they can be much more loving and accepting about these kids who are committing suicide at alarmingly high rates in Utah because they don't see where they can fit in or belong, or because they feel unworthy of love and unworthy of self-acceptance. They are sinners, and of the worst kind.
right, it's really rough on those type of kids. There's no question about it. Here's a good question: is that your children are the daughters and sons of somebody who left, what's it like for them? I mean, as somebody who comes from your lineage, from Samuel Smith's lineage, what's it like, and how did you kind of acclimate your children to growing up like one step from Mormonism?
Well, I think because by the time my kids were old enough to have questions, we were doing family reunions. It came up quite frequently, what do they believe and why do they believe that and why don't you believe it and why do they believe it and what is the funny thing underwear that they're wearing under their clothes? They had a lot of questions, and it came up because of their interaction with their cousins and their aunts and uncles at family reunions. And but the real they didn't grow up the same way I did, and I'm grateful that they didn't have that kind of invasive, restrictive, repressive ideology forced on them. And so they can't really understand why their cousins can't break away. But interestingly enough, some of them have. And I have had my nieces and nephews reach out to me now and say, how do I talk to my parents about this?
Oh,
I don't believe. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to tell them, or I don't know why they won't why they aren't curious about why I'm leaving.
There's so much more information. Like you said, that you were kind of atomized, or being in New York City, it's a lot harder. But now the resources are out there. At least there's places of knowledge where people like people can find you. You can just do a type and find ex-Mormons.
Absolutely. Ex-Mormons, Mormons in recovery. There's tons of places to get support. And I really encourage that for anybody who's going through the process, is to get support, get individual support, professional support for yourself, because so much of this dysfunction is tied up in the Mormon narrative that was imprinted at such an early age when we were defenseless against it.
Right. John B. asks again, are the Freemasons and Joseph Smith in conflict? I don't know if you know an answer to that question. Do you want to address that?
I don't know the answer to that. I heard stories that there was some disagreement. I don't know if they patched things up or not.
Yeah, my understanding is that party that went and got him out of that jail was Masonic. Like they were all dressed in black. So it might have been an internal kind of like
Well, I'm sure they didn't like the fact that he had copied Masonic rituals and then turned them into his own religious ceremonies. And because Masonic rules forbid them to share that information. So I'm sure they were not happy with Joseph Smith. At least that's what I heard.
So we are at the hour mark. I mean, we've talked about this. There's Mormons, there's therapists, there's counselors. Like, what would you recommend for somebody like reach out to you, or where would they go? What do you recommend?
Yeah, on my website, I is lynsmithgregory.com, and I have blogs that I talk about different issues that are related to family estrangement or depression rates or why it's hard to leave. And also I just encourage you to email me at lynsmithgregory@gmail.com.
You have an unpublished book, right? This is We Were the
Yeah,
Source.
it's currently being shopped by my agent to publishers, and we're in the process, and we've heard back from 8 who are now reading the manuscript. So I'm hoping we're going to find a home for it soon.
Great. And so the best place to contact you as well is at your website, right?
Correct.
People have any follow-up questions.
And that will keep you apprised of what the path to publication is like. And also, I'd love to hear your story and what your experience has been, whether it's escaping from a high control religion, or that's Mormon, or other similar religion.
Out there. I've talked to a lot of those people, including yourself. And again, the guest we had today was Lyn Smith Gregory, first name spelled Lyn. I'll put a link to her website. And we talked about Mormonism and people who get shunned or who are, have that problem, estrangement from their family. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Good. Nice talking to you. Stay there.